The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Are your internal controls still valid? Before we begin, just want to go over a couple updates regarding today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been placed on mute. Should you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the questions tab and we'll get to them as time permits. This webinar will also be recorded, and that recording will be sent out shortly after completion. Additionally, there are 3 poll questions that will be popping up throughout this webinar, and if you are interested in CPE credit, you will need to complete all 3 of those polling questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. As a principal in Bloom's advisory group, Christine DeMena provides audit and risk assessment services to a wide variety of companies and nonprofit organizations, including foundations, colleges, universities, independent schools, and healthcare organizations. She provides services such as Sarbanes-Oxley readiness and compliance, corporate compliance, internal audit, risk management, and assessment of internal controls. As the director at Bloom, David Nowacki has over 18 years of combined experience with management advisory and information security. He has worked with both government agencies and private businesses in setting strategies, reviewing and assessing operations, governance and enterprise risk management practices, project and program management practices, information security programs, and in identifying process improvement opportunities. David has helped a variety of organizations define, document, and refine their strategies and business processes, identify automation opportunities, select technology solutions to realize efficiencies, and integrate metrics and key performance indicators into business processes. I'd now like to hand it over to Christine DeMena to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Jared. So as we all know, companies were forced to quickly transition to a remote work environment this year, regardless of your level of preparedness. Key controls and processes were likely impacted by this sudden change to a remote work environment. Deficiencies that existed prior to this may have been exposed in the transition, and employees may not have been able to perform key duties remotely, which could lead to a breakdown in controls, lack of segregation of duties, and greatly increases the risk for fraud or error. So today, we're going to examine what a baseline risk profile looks like and how things may have changed. Talk about the new normal of the internal controls environment, and also lastly, discuss the importance of an internal audit function and what benefits it can provide.
Yeah, so as Christine said, the changes that the pandemic has inflicted upon organizations are pretty substantial, and we're probably not going to return to normal anytime soon. At Bloom, we have this concept that we work with our clients on called Telework Transformation and managing remote work risks. And so there's several domains that we will talk about throughout this webinar that certainly have an impact from an internal control perspective, but includes things like business continuity, which includes your traditional sense of continuing operations, but also how does that extend to the continuity and minimizing the impact on your processes and responsibilities. Bringing technologies to your employees who are working remotely. So how do you enable them to do their job and duties better and differently given the remote work environment, and how does that change? Processes and procedures, which includes a significant amount of internal controls and oversight. We're going to talk a bit about security in terms of protecting your organization, but also making sure that you're thinking ahead to what may have changed and bettering your existing solutions for a dynamic that's not likely to go back to the old way of doing things. And I think more important, among the more important things that we're going to talk about is managing compliance and third-party oversight. Just because I think there's been a significant shift in the reliance on third parties, so we'll be sure to highlight that as well. So as we kind of look through what an internal audit and risk management and controls evaluation perspective looks like, I think we're going to highlight these areas as well.
So as a background, internal control is designed to assist organizations in achieving their objectives. So this lays out the 5 components of COSO's internal control integrated framework and how they work together to mitigate the risks of an organization's failure to achieve those objectives. The COSO framework has 17 principles mapped to the various 5 components, and our discussion today will touch on each of these components. The control environment is the first one, and that describes a set of standards and processes that provide the basis for carrying out internal control across the organization. Sometimes referred to as tone at the top, the control environment is critical to the internal control framework. The second piece is risk assessment, and the risk assessment really forms the basis for determining how all of the various risks will be managed. Control activities are actions that help management mitigate risks in order to achieve the objectives. And they can be both preventative or detective in nature, and also include controls related to technology. Information is obtained or generated by management both internally and externally to support the other internal control components. And communication is also based on internal and external sources, and that's how you communicate important information throughout and outside of the organization. And lastly, monitoring activities are periodic or ongoing evaluations that verify each of the 5 components are present and functioning, as well as the controls within each component. In addition, any deficiencies or opportunities for improvement are communicated and evaluated in this process. So the objectives of the framework really allow an organization to focus on all different aspects of internal control, including operational, reporting, and compliance-related objectives. So some companies recognize that their internal controls have significantly changed this past year, while other companies have not yet done this evaluation or inventoried those changes. It's really important to be proactive and investigate and address any changes to the internal control environment before a breakdown in controls causes a problem. So some questions to ask of your organization are, has there been any changes to the way controls operate? So are controls that used to be more manual processes now being automated? Has the level of risk changed? Has a frequency of control performance changed? For example, as when employees are in the office, bank reconciliations and other items may have been reviewed immediately on a monthly basis. With the change to remote work, some of these processes might have fallen behind and are being caught up when employees are back in the office periodically. Has the control owner changed? So for some key controls, employees that are remote may not be able to perform these control activities, and maybe the control owner has now been assigned to somebody else. Has the operational decision-making been changed? Have you reviewed your policies and procedures to see if they need revisions? And do you have contingency plans in place in the event of employee absent to execute key controls? So do you have appropriate cross-training of key duties, as well as these processes outlined so that others could perform them if needed?
All right, at this time we've got our first poll question. Again, if you're attending for CPE, these are required. And the poll should be out there right now, distributing. Give about another 10 seconds, 10, 15 seconds here to get in your selections. Perfect. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jared. So it looks like from that poll, approximately over 80% have either only had general discussions about changes or have not had these discussions yet. So I would highly recommend that you make that a priority, and you'll see why as we go through the presentation. So the first component we're going to talk about is the control environment. And it's really the key component of the entity's internal control. Not only does it set the tone of an entity, it influences the people within the company and is the foundation for all other components of the internal control system. So companies should be able to support changes to the control environment with proper documentation, approvals, and consideration of segregation of duties. Many companies focus solely on activity level controls, for example, bank reconciliations or procedures surrounding cash disbursements. However, you really need to also look at the entity as a whole. Many risks have emerged that could negatively impact the control environment. So one is, remote work really has changed how many controls are being executed. It also has led to less oversight and in some cases, decreases in communication between employees. In some instances, there may be a lack of cross-training for critical functions, and there's also a risk of non-compliance with policies. So some of the next steps of this piece, really re-emphasizing integrity and ethics across the company. Involve all of your employees to discuss changes in operations and processes and controls. Consider digitizing certain processes. For example, accounts payable may be one of those processes that is very manual, and is there a way to start digitizing some of that to help implement stronger controls? Do you have a remote work policy? Have you established guidelines and communicated those to your employees, not only with their job responsibilities and duties, but also how they're connecting to the network and what equipment they're using to do that on their end? And finally, just making sure that proper supervision and training is being done and provided, even for those employees that are working remotely. We just don't see remote work going away anytime soon.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I'm going to reinforce a couple things that have changed given the dynamic of the remote work environment in the pandemic. Control environment, that tone at the top and culture is vitally important, that you recognize that things have changed and that culture and the tone at the top and your overarching environment needs to adapt to that. Christine mentioned, updated guidelines on expectations in telework. We are instilling trust, extending trust to employees when they are within the physical walls of our businesses. We're enabling them to be autonomous and plan throughout their day. But that comes with risk, such as lost productivity, taking advantage of time and leniency, maybe being able to utilize multitasking and technologies at the same time as they're using business technologies. So I think it's vitally important to reinforce that integrity mantra, which is what you do when no one is watching defines your level of professionalism and integrity. So make sure you reinforce that, and while empowering, while giving trust. How have you adapted your expectations for supervision and oversight, as well as that the cycle of accountability? So have managers who are used to being having staff within the physical walls and being a hallway away from cubicles and offices for their employees, how have they adapted to a work environment that enables employees to be productive, that ensures accountability? This is not something that everyone is innately trained or capable of doing. So don't assume that your managers have the right skills, experiences, and tools to oversee employees. Likewise for staff, have they been trained where to report progress, how often? There's a tendency to, when you're captive in front of a screen throughout the day, there's a tendency for people to over communicate. That could have negative implications for employees in terms of micromanaging and things like that. So make sure you have formal guidelines in place for expectations for managers and employees. And I think it's important to note that employment life cycle and that employment experience needs to be modified to enable your employees to be successful. So that third bullet there about making sure that your employees have the right training resources, that new employees you may have been brought on board during this pandemic who don't have any experiences in physical work environments, don't assume that they have the level of engagement and commitment from the organization that you think, without adapting that to the new reality that we're facing. And so all of these things are vitally important. I think, don't assume that your tone extends to a work environment if you haven't intentionally thought about what it should look like going forward. And as I said at the beginning, this is, control environment is one of those things that you need to rely pretty heavily on to make sure that there isn't a drop off in internal controls.
So the second component is risk assessment. And risk assessments are performed to help assess the size and the magnitude of risk, not just individually, but also collectively. And that allows management to focus their attention on the most vital threats as well as the biggest opportunities. It's an important process because it helps you to prioritize and measure these risks. Risk assessments can also be targeted to certain areas such as enterprise risk, fraud risk, and information technology risks. Some of the prevalent risks that may exist in the current business environment: one, huge increase in opportunities for fraud and error as job responsibilities and duties and who's been doing them and the oversight have changed. It really opens the door to vulnerability of not only fraud, but also, error as well. There may be more pressure to meet organizational goals. A lot of companies have had to furlough or lay off employees, and it puts a lot of pressure on the remaining employees to keep things running and to meet those goals of the company. With the change to remote work and the reduction in employees in some cases, there may have been inadequate processes and controls implemented on the fly. So have those processes and new controls or changes to those controls really been vetted to make sure that they are strong and that they have the proper segregation of duties as well. And then also management override of controls as people were unavailable, less employees, not everybody being able to be in the office. Have there been internal controls that have been bypassed or overridden that you're not aware of? So some of the next steps, if you have any existing risk assessments, review those as well as your current processes. Consider doing an enterprise risk assessment, so starting really from the top down to look at not only the more minute process and control-driven activities, but also risks to the organization as a whole. And then try to assess those significant risks and existence of any mitigation plans, as well as really reviewing those processes in detail.
Yeah. Again, we're going to talk about what has changed, and I think an important but often overlooked area is the compliance component of managing enterprise risk. And so there are a lot of things that were introduced organizationally and from a technology and operational perspective for most organizations. The impact was felt throughout. And so did your internal controls you had at the time stay the same, or did compliance expand? Adopting new technologies, adopting Zoom, Microsoft Teams, other cloud technologies, looking for ways to better enable remote workforce through through VPNs and things like that. And we'll talk about security in a little while. But what did that do to compliance? Do you now have an expanded burden of compliance? Do you have to implement more and better controls to make sure you don't have sanctions or you don't have fines that are imposed upon you? And so this is one of those things that as we get into the end of this year, looking at how remote work environment will remain, what are your gaps? Have you identified it? Has there been a focused effort to say, this is what we looked like last year? How does that change? Do you need to document mitigating controls, compensating controls? Did you lose segregation of duties requirements that you had? Dual authorization of transactions and the like. So I think it's important to make sure that you increase the frequency of your self-assessments from a compliance risk perspective. And if you have any questions, be sure you seek professional guidance or have an independent party come in and do a gap assessment. And I think, more importantly, when it comes to compliance, proactively engage with regulators, auditors, and oversight bodies just to see what their points of emphasis are. They understand that there are changes across the regulatory front. And so, I think it's important to have those proactive conversations so that you understand what they're going to look at enforcing as we move into the new normal.
So the third is control activities. And control activities and other mechanisms should be designed proactively to address and mitigate significant risks. And in recent months, control activities have definitely changed. Some of the risks are, one, changes to controls haven't been approved or documented. So what the process documentation that exists or that is known to the company is not what is actually happening. And maybe that also the changes have not been approved and vetted. Your data might no longer be adequately protected, and David will talk about that in a little more detail as well. Have you had to change user access to any of your programs that you use, and have those been vetted as well? And then do you have controls that are either missing or outdated? So some of the next steps here, I would recommend a review of your segregation of duties for key processes to make sure that they still have the appropriate safeguards in place, even where you can't fully segregate duties between employees. If you have the opportunity to automate controls, look into that. Are there ways to streamline your accounts payable process or how you receive cash? Are there more monitoring controls that can be put into place or strengthened or done on a more frequently basis? And then also changes in your security controls. Have those been accumulated and documented? And we did get one question coming in. The question was, I'm a board member of an association that only has 3 full-time staff, so it's difficult to spread responsibilities. Is there any guidance or maybe a best practice checklist where the board members' turnover and staff is not monitored very closely? So I would respond, number one, I would highly recommend doing a segregation of duties review and really documenting who's in charge of which key control activities in your key processes, such as cash disbursements, cash receipts, payroll, and making sure that not only are the proper safeguards in place as to who's performing each duty, but also looking at who has access to perform that duty. So just because one person is the person doing the control, it doesn't mean that others don't have access to those controls if they wanted to circumvent the process. So also looking at access controls as well. Some resources out there, the National Councils of Nonprofits website has a lot of great resources for smaller organizations. And lastly, in a case like this, you really need some involvement from the board to help provide some additional oversight, whether it's reviewing a quarterly payroll change report that comes directly from your payroll provider, or being involved more with the budget to actual, and maybe even overview of looking at some of the bank statements periodically and canceled checks. So I think there's a few different things to think about in a small organization. Segregation of duties is really an impossible task to have perfect segregation of duties with a limited number of employees, but there are certainly safeguards to be put in place and additional controls to help ensure that the proper oversight is there. There was another related question as well. What is the best way to get rid of cash receipts? And I'm going to turn that one over to David.
Yeah, I think the cash will not be going away anytime soon, but I think this is a perfect opportunity to minimize the use of cash. And to that bullet number 2 on the right about next steps is to automate payments, automate invoicing and leverage cloud technologies and embrace whether it's mobile app-based payments, whether it's using payment processors, a higher proportion of activity for your organization, embracing things like Venmo and PayPal if it makes sense, allowing automation to enable better accountability for cash. And I think you should be having a cash management strategy session just to see how that should change, because you don't want cash to have to go into employees' homes or employees to have to unnecessarily go into the office to grab cash and deposit it. And so I think there's some timeliness considerations. There's also some accountability and potential fraud considerations. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to embrace, the change and say, what can we do to automate? Jared, if you could advance the slide. We don't want to talk about fraud or misuse of assets, but I think this is control activities are designed largely to ensure that assets are controlled throughout your organization and that numbers and dollars are an accurate reflection. And so the dynamic for fraud or misuse or breakdown of controls has changed significantly with the remote work environment. Segregation of duty issues may come arise due to layoffs. Security, I'll talk about that in the next couple slides. Timeliness of reviews in a non-physical environment, a virtual environment. In some cases, it's just not as clear how and when and what, unless you intentionally design new systems of control to make sure that those things are happening. We talked about cash management a bit. Ensuring access to bank accounts are adequately controlled, that you're using dual authorization of transactions when banking and financial institutions, allow you to. Implementing multi-factor for certain transactions, I think, is vitally important. So as we kind of talk about what has changed, I'm going to highlight security fairly extensively, because I think that is one of the risks that we should not assume are adequately controlled in a remote work environment. So Jared, do you want to advance the slide? So what has changed? We had, back in the spring and certainly extending into the summer for most organizations, you had a rapid expansion of remote workforce. So controls changed. We see several different dynamics that enabled remote and telework. Computers we're used to having in our office, whether you had workstations or you had laptops at the time, they're taken home. And by doing that, you now open up remote work to everyone, VPNs to everyone. You don't necessarily know what's going on in your employees' homes. And have you talked to employees about that? Do you have basic checklists for employees for securing their work environment? Otherwise, the exact same, secured business assets are now connected to your systems potentially. So how do you know the Ring doorbell appliance or the smart home or TV or the smart coffee player is different? Is segregated from your business assets? Is it supposed to be? Have you communicated those expectations? How do you make sure that patching and security of your assets are being performed? In other cases, we ended up buying duplicate workstations. So how did you rapidly deploy new workstations and laptops to your employees? Did you have the right security built in, or did we buy it off the shelf or buy it from a supplier and ship to our employees? In some instances, we have clients that doubled their number of endpoints, doubled the number of workstations that are connected to the network. That doubles what I call the threat surface area. And so there's potential vulnerabilities that kind of rise throughout your entire environment when you do that. Progressing to the next slide, we have a couple more examples of what happened. So employees working from personal devices. You may not have had the resources to buy new workstations, or you didn't have the time to take business assets home. And so employees were provided direct access. How does that separate? How how do you separate, business traffic from personal traffic? Looking at kids, the dynamic that they introduce in terms of using cell phones, using iPads, shoulder surfing over their parents, taking the advantage of a workstation that isn't locked in parents' office. All of this presents potential threat. I think one of the more important things is this second bullet in the middle, rapid adoption of cloud and collaboration tools. We were forced to consider in a short period of time how we can enable remote workforces. So things like Office 365, Teams, Zoom, Slack, a number of other cloud collaboration tools, all of that expands your security risk. And most of them are very secure solutions, but we saw, in the early spring, things like Zoom bombing, people observing other Zoom sessions and potentially exposing organizations to privacy risks and breaches. And so making sure that you're looking at those new tools in a smart way, enabling multi-factor authentication when you can, making sure that you secure the configurations of that after the fact. So all of these things need to be looked at from an IT audit and cybersecurity perspective. And I think, not to be forgotten is how you manage your employees' ability to do work given differences in bandwidth, differences in internet services, rural versus urban environments, and what does that look like from an internet service perspective. All of this has a significant impact in your organization and shouldn't go without some level of review as to what the new normal needs to be, and make sure that you have the right controls in place. So I think that just a progression on all new technologies, each type of technology, each method you use to enable remote work environment, do they require new controls? Did controls go away? Have you adequately assessed the risks associated with public, home and public Wi-Fi? Did you communicate expectations to employees? How are you patching vulnerabilities? Are there new risks related to social engineering and phishing your employees? They're now sitting at home managing their work emails, but they may also be checking personal emails or emails related to school because you have a remote learning environment. So how are you educating your employees or assessing the risk with that? Managing potential leakage when you have data leakage is when data in smaller amounts goes out the door without your knowing it. And so with data in multiple different systems or new technologies, how are you ensuring that data is adequately protected? Do you have visibility into the use of new technologies in the cloud? And I think more importantly is, how are you engaging with employees, educating them on the right way to use technologies and ensuring accountability? And so do those monitoring and oversight controls extend to that work environment from a technology perspective? I think this needs a constant, at least quarterly to monthly reassessment as we adapt new technologies that are potentially changing what our security posture look like.
All right, we're going to launch the second poll question here. Again, if you're attending for CPE, you'll need to do all three poll questions. So this is the second one of the three. We'll leave it open for about 45 seconds or so here. Keep it open for about another 10-15 seconds here for anyone looking to get in their choice. Great, I'm gonna close this down and hand it back over to the presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. The fourth area we'll talk about is information and communication. And management really needs quality and relevant information to support the overall internal control system. It's really vital to achieve your objectives. There have been some risks related to this component. One is delays in closing the books or performance of key controls. And we've seen that a lot. Companies are having a more difficult time closing the books timely and being ready, to finalize financial statements with people either out, remote, and dealing with the whole new slew of issues we're dealing with, especially with those with children in the house and trying to do remote learning as well as do our jobs. There is a risk with unable to meet your reporting deadlines. So if you have had a delay in closing your books, how does that affect your reporting deadlines for your debt covenants or your bank deadlines, or even up to management or the board? Are you adequately disclosing any events in those financial statements? So have you had proper disclosures related to COVID or other business events that have happened over the past year or so? And then also, have you had communication breakdowns? As many employees are remote, and we have seen a significant increase in teleconferencing, but have we really maintained the communications that we need to maintain in order to have effective internal controls? The next steps, just making sure you have a timeline and reestablishing that as necessary, keeping employees informed on the timing of when information needs to be completed, reviewed, submitted, and really when things are due. Scheduling regular status meetings, so just checking in with employees on a regular basis to make sure that they're doing okay, that they're keeping up with their schedule, and helping to address those concerns. And then leveraging more of those automated tools. So as David mentioned, leveraging Zoom and Teams and all of these other tools that now we're all very familiar with. Are we using them to the best of their abilities to communicate information across the organization?
And just to expand upon what's changed, are you leveraging remote tools to minimize the risk? And communication breakdowns can happen fairly easily. They can also cause, traditional communication methods can cause timeliness issues. And so now is one of those times to embrace things like electronic signatures and minimizing hard copy paperwork if you can. It's seamless these days to be able to implement e-signatures, and many organizations are holding on or resisting just because there's a cost implication to it, but I think now is the time. Taking a look at manual versus automated systems, so expense reporting, printing out receipts, stapling them together and handing them to your finance department. I think we need to strongly consider changing things like that. We talked about electronic payments, and we're reducing the reliance on cash transactions, and so that's another opportunity. Have we changed expectations for engagement with employees, two-way engagement and oversight? I talked about this a little while ago as well, but there is a fairly high level of reliance on traditional oversight, and assuming your employees, if they're in the walls of your business, are going to be accountable, are going to be progressing. But we need to make sure that we have those changes described very clearly to our employees and backed up with training. Have we developed clear timelines for deliverables, for reporting? Are we using things like Microsoft Teams or other tools to convey deadlines? Have we identified potential backup personnel in the event someone goes out for a long-term quarantine or gets sick or ends up getting, there ends up being more rounds of layoffs? Do you know how to rapidly deploy backup resources in that case? And I think just the method used to communicate, drop-ins into office scheduled meetings, I think those have changed as well. Whether it's external customer focused or it's internal focused as well. You need to probably embrace more changes in terms of scheduling and automated solutions for that as well.
Did we lose audio here?
Let me check. Christine?
No, Jared, I was just checking with the mute button. Talking with the mute button on, sorry. So lastly, monitoring. The most effective way to mitigate the risk of fraud is by designing and implementing strong internal controls. However, if those are not being monitored, you are leaving yourselves vulnerable to increased opportunities for fraud or error. Some of the risks, one is lack of a business continuity plan. And that's really a proactive plan to avoid and mitigate risks associated with the disruption of operations. And it should have the steps to be taken before, during, and after an event to ensure that operations can be continued and sustained even while working remotely. It should also address the risk of data loss and have an established process to protect and recover data. And the same theory applies to disaster recovery. An outdated or an untested plan could be a huge risk to the company. There's been a huge increased use of unsecured networks, mobile devices, and home Wi-Fi. And I do believe there have been undocumented changes to the overall control environment, and that really is a huge risk. So some of the next steps, make sure you update or establish business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Make sure you're taking cybersecurity into consideration. Try to implement things to streamline your processes and implement improvements. And also make sure that you're increasing your communication. As employees are remote, having that increased communication is really crucial.
So some of the key areas of change when it comes to monitoring is how are you overseeing your vendor relationships? We mentioned earlier about rapid expansion of remote and telework environment arrangements, adoption of new technologies and controls. In some cases, we had to hire new vendors. In some cases, vendors went away. And so I think you need to have a heightened level of risk evaluation for your vendors, whether you're doing vendor due diligence for initial new vendors or you're doing periodic risk assessments. You need to engage with them and understand what they're doing from a security perspective. Did they have to enable their entire workforce to work from home? And does that expand your threat service area as well? Can you tie remote access not to vendor resources, but to their offices? So they have to remote into their office and then remote into yours. There are methods you can use to maintain a certain level of control from that perspective. Where's your data being stored? So did vendors change where data that you provide to them is being stored? And have you looked at the risk related to that? And one of the more frightening, I think, areas is this concept of business resiliency. And so we need to look at our vendors a little bit differently. Even if you've had longstanding relationships with them, many companies are struggling significantly from a financial perspective. A lot of companies we do work with won't be there in a quarter or two. And so will your critical vendors still be around? Do you have easily replaceable vendors? Have you been looking at that? Are you engaging with your vendors as to what their situation is and the likelihood that they'll be around? These are conversations that that need to be embedded into your vendor oversight program. And I think this is probably one of the deepest levels of change that we can experience in this pandemic is how we're leveraging partners and third parties. So we need to take a look at how we're overseeing those organizations. So some of the areas that we want to make sure we prioritize, just from an internal audit perspective, looking at areas of control. I mentioned this at the very beginning, making sure you're looking at that control environment, looking at your culture. Has it changed? Has it adapted? Have policies and procedures been updated? Are you engaging with your employees appropriately? Are you making sure you're empowering, instilling trust, but also assuring accountability? Are you demonstrating a level of commitment to their competencies, whether it's upkeeping existing skills or teaching them new skills and training in terms of leveraging remote work tools? Are you reassessing that mutual value proposition that your organization has to make sure your employees understand that they are valued? and reinstilling that mantra of integrity and ethics. We can't do it as easily in a work environment, but we need to do it intentionally and design our systems to be resilient over time. Other areas that I would make sure you prioritize is just understand what they're doing at home. Understand the challenges, the obstacles they have, making sure you're adapting policies and procedures and communicating expectations. Make sure you're looking at security, establishing best practice checklists for home network security and the like. Making sure you're giving them the training that they need to be successful in a non-physical world, in a virtual world, that they understand and they're supported. Invest in automation. I've mentioned that before, but I think that's one of those areas that we need to look at most of our processes across the board that operate in a physical environment and take a look at automation opportunities. And looking at that succession planning, business resiliency concept, whether it's vendors, whether it's employees, and the like. And so I think those are some areas we've bulleted out that I think you need to prioritize. And traditional audit processes still need to function, but these ones have definitely changed and need, your eyes on them sooner than later.
So the importance of an internal audit function, and really an internal audit function is going to help you manage those emerging risks and threats to your control environment, provide you with a mechanism to weigh those risks and opportunities, as well as providing assurance on the effectiveness when you get into that control testing stage of the process. It also helps to increase communication across the board between employees, management, and owners or boards, and can help you assist with business continuity and crisis management. An internal audit function really can be scaled to the size of your organization, and you can start small if needed, but having some level of an internal audit function can really help your business. Next slide. So we had a question come in, what does a good internal audit control function look like? So here's one example of a strong internal audit program. And in my mind, it really starts with assessment of enterprise risk. And this should involve management, owners, board members, as well as key departmental employees. And this information gathering exercise can help you identify significant risks to the company without focusing just solely on the finance function. It can also help you identify risks related to lost opportunities and what can you be doing to not miss out on ways to improve the organization or the business. From here, you would develop your internal audit strategic plan. I would think you would want to update it at least annually and include input from management and owners or board members. A robust internal audit plan would include rotational audits as well as targeted reviews if you know you have problem areas or you suspect problem areas, as well as considering some of those enterprise risk items as well. And again, you can scale your internal audit program to the size and the capacity of your organization, whether it's looking at 2 or 3 targeted areas a year and incorporating a couple of those higher level risks, or doing a more thorough rotational basis of all of the areas. Once you identify your plan, you would then document and look at the effectiveness of the control environment that you're evaluating. And here you would also identify process area improvements that could be implemented as well. And then the fourth, controls testing. Here is where you would test those key controls that you identified in your documentation stage, as well as evaluate any mitigation strategies you have in place for some of those higher level enterprise risk items. You would also then remediate the controls, implement needed process improvements, and do some retesting if you felt that was necessary as well. And then finally, the last part, ongoing reporting and communication is really key. If you do implement some sort of an internal audit program or have one already, I would think that would be a standing agenda item and something that you want to be talking about on an ongoing basis to really make sure you have, a robust internal audit function.
All right, we're going to launch our last poll question here. Keep this open just for a few more seconds here for people to get some last second choices in here. Great, thank you everyone. Now we're going to get to some questions. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the questions tab here, and we can try to get to some of them. We've got a few here that have come in, so we'll start with these. David, I know you talked a bit about IT. Can you talk about how people should be looking at IT differently in a remote work environment?
Yeah, certainly. I think 2 or 3 areas are definitely expanded in terms of levels of importance from an IT perspective. And one is to get your head around how are you ensuring security vulnerabilities are minimized. So it's the concept of a patch management, right? And I've been talking about patches for 15 years now, and it's never going to go away. You're still going to have to patch your systems. And so whether that means setting expectations for the use of home devices on that your employees are using if they're personal, in terms of setting up patches, deploying solutions like remote desktops, virtual desktops that enable you to patch centrally, and your employees are logging into that remotely rather than logging in directly to their device. Only using company issued laptops going forward, and using mobile device management solutions to control patching, deploy patches, and to monitor systems. And so those are things that many companies are already doing, but it's even more important when you have devices that are out there. And I would say encryption, make sure that you're leveraging whole disk encryption for any devices that have company data or potentially have company data on them. So that's one of those areas that I would make sure you ensure as well. Huge threat with respect to phishing and social engineering. And so anything we can do to proactively assess our employees, evaluate who may be susceptible to clicking on malicious links. There's such a substantial increase in phishing attempts, and many of them are highly sophisticated, that go along the lines of COVID type topics all the way to PPP program topics and anything like that. We see some highly sophisticated phishing attempts that are attacking organizations and their employees. So you can proactively phish your employees as well. And then I can't emphasize enough communication. So anytime a potential issue comes up from an IT perspective, your employees should be extra cautious and escalate to your IT staff, to their manager as quickly as possible, because things can go off the rails fairly quickly if you don't have those protocols in place in a remote work environment. So those are some of the control things that I think you need to make sure that you instill.
Thanks. Christine, this one's for you, and I know you kind of just walked us through a bit of the different steps regarding an internal audit program, but for someone who's looking to get started, how do they get started with implementing that program there?
Well, I think first of all, you really need it to come from the top. So you need to have the support of management, the board, the owners, whoever it may be, and the appetite to do this. So educating on the importance of an internal audit program. And then, as I said, you could start small. You could start by targeting some problem areas or some areas that you have concerns over, or some of your higher risk areas such as cash, and having an independent review of that function, and then reporting that back up. So it doesn't have to start with looking at at 8 to 9 different audits a year. I know that's a lot for many organizations, but start where your concerns are. Ask your employees what their concerns are, and that can help drive maybe a starting point. And again, having the buy-in and the support of management is really critical.
Great. Thanks, Christine. I think that about wraps it up for today's webinar. So appreciate everyone coming out to today's webinar. Again, this was recorded, and we'll be sending out that recording along with the slide deck. So thank you, everyone, for your time. Appreciate you joining us today.